Good afternoon, everybody. I see 79%, but to be honest, I don't believe it. Is that my experience going in and doing Agile consulting, which I do a lot of, is that the vast majority of companies that I work with that think that they're being Agile are not. That doesn't mean that they all aren't, as there are a bunch of perfectly good, perfectly Agile companies out there in the world. But truth to tell, Agile has come to mean something other than it means. Or to put it another way, the word Agile has been kind of twisted around to the point where people don't really even recognize it anymore. And the obvious problem there is not so much that the word is being messed with, but rather that if you're not doing things in an Agile way, then you're not going to get the results that you expect to get when you do things in an Agile way. So that's essentially what this talk is about. Is I'm going to talk about what's gone wrong. I'm going to talk about how to fix it, about what Agile actually is, what it should be. And then at the end of things, we'll have some questions. I've left some time for questions. So first of all, there's this notion of Agile being dead, the death of Agile. Death of Agile was a meme a few years ago, is that you saw a lot of talks about the death of Agile. I gave one myself, Andy Hunt gave one with the same title. This was completely random. We both had scheduled these talks long before we knew about each other's titles. And the problem is that both of us were seeing the same difficulty with the way that Agile is implemented out in the real world. The way that Andy put it was that Agile has come to mean do half of Scrum badly and use Jira. And there's some truth to that, is that Jira is the work of the devil as far as I'm concerned. It is not a viable tool for doing things in an Agile way. And in fact, tools like Jira actually move people away from agility, is that the tool itself kind of manipulates people into not thinking in Agile ways. There's a lot of stuff in Jira that is just wrong, I think. The idea of a hierarchy of epics that contains stories, for example, that's just really not the way it actually works. So the issue then is that the tools are working against us. The other, what do I do with my clicker? There we go. The other issue, which is an important one, is that is Kent Beck. Kent Beck was one of the originators of Agile, and Kent Beck said, I think quite reasonably, that Agile has come to be a devastated wasteland, to use his own tools, his own terms. I'm paraphrasing here, but basically what he's saying is that it's become a priesthood where the priests don't really understand the rituals that they're telling people to follow anymore. And that's also, I think, quite true, is the more and more it's become a formulaic way of working, where the formulas are, again, not well understood. So we need to fix that. This Agile really is not Agile anymore. So let's talk about the problems. First, I'm going to do this in the context of George Orwell, because I think that's very important here, so that it actually works. The first issue is war is peace. That was Orwell's, one of the things written on the side of the Ministry of Information in Orwell's 1984. So what does that mean? First of all, there's a tension between what Agile is and what Agile is supposed to be, what the industry says it is. In Orwell's book, the notion of war and peace was you had a totalitarian state who was in a perpetual state of war. And what they were saying is that you maintain peace by being in a perpetual state of war. Now, the fact is that oops, sorry, I have a slight technical problem here. This will take about 2 seconds to fix. All right. And we see that a lot in the Agile community. There is ongoing series of process wars between the people that have, between people that have their own processes to sell. I got some advertising material from David Anderson's Kanban method the other day that was basically attacking every other Agile method. It was saying, we have the one true Agile, and everything else is completely ineffective, and you've completely wasted your time and money by dealing with it, and you've got to go take our course instead. Jeff Sutherland, who's pushing Agile certification with his Scrum Inc., and also to some extent with the Agile Alliance. Jeff has been hardcore about saying Scrum is the one true Agile, to the point where there's been quite a bit of revisionism historically about how Agile worked. Is that back when I first learned about Agile ways of working, or at least formally Agile ways of working, the only Agile process that anybody had heard of was extreme programming, XP. Kent Beck's book, Extreme Programming Explained, was the first book on Agile that anybody had ever read. Nobody had ever heard of Scrum. It wasn't until 3, 4, 5 years later that Scrum started kind of coming onto the scene and people started paying attention to it. And in fact, Scrum, when it first came onto the scene, was presented as a wrapper around XP. If you go find the very first book on Scrum that was written by Ken Schwaber and Mike Beadle back in the very early 2000s, on the back of the cover in big letters, it presents Scrum as a wrapper around XP that makes XP more palatable, if you will, to people in business. So this notion that Scrum is Agile and Scrum came first, that's part of these process wars, is that the people who are pushing certificates, the people who are pushing their own methods, they're at constant war with each other, and they see that as a good thing because it makes them money. So that's not, of course, benefiting any of us. Is that, for one thing, there are too many companies that believe the propaganda, and they come into the world of Agile thinking that Agile is a specific thing. You can bring in a bunch of trainers, and the trainers will do their work, and suddenly you'll be Agile. Is that you'll sprinkle around magic Agile fairy dust, and poof, the company turns into Agile. And that's really not the way it works. Is what we have, in other words, to use Martin Fowler's term, is an Agile industrial complex. A bunch of corporations that are making money by pushing this false notion of Agile onto us. And it might benefit those corporations, but it sure doesn't benefit the companies that think that they're Agile. So what they're doing is not Agile, but they nonetheless call it Agile. So let me give you some examples. Is that all Agile processes center work around so-called self-organizing teams. And by self-organizing, people really mean self-organizing. They really mean that the team gets to control how it does its work. The team gets to control who's on the team. The team gets to control what it's working on. Is that the team it's not autonomous in the completely isolated from everything else sense, but it's autonomous in the sense that it has control over its own destiny. Most companies that claim to do Agile are not doing that. You go into a so-called Agile shop, and the first thing that I see in a lot of them is somebody with the title of project manager in charge of the Agile team. Well, Agile teams don't have project managers because they're self-organizing. First of all, there's nobody managing them. They manage themselves. Let's put it that way, is that they manage their own work. So if you have somebody that has the role of a project manager or the role of a team manager or the role of a line manager, that's taking away from the self-organization, which is central to the way that Agile teams have to work. But companies, of course, don't want the teams to be fully autonomous because they don't trust them. Is we are working in a 19th century Taylorist model where the software development is seen as an assembly line kind of operation, where the people on the assembly line are inherently lazy, incompetent workers, and you have to have managers watching over them in order to make sure that they get work done. And that's not the way that the real world works. It's certainly not the way that the software development world works, and it's certainly not Agile. Is Agile centers on people. And if you're not treating your people well, then you're not working in an Agile way. So the other thing about project managers, which is equally important, is that more and more now in the Agile world, the whole notion of a project is considered a bad idea. In other words, instead of working on projects, we're working on products, on the entire product. So you try and get work done. How do you do that? Well, you look at a Agile team that's working in the proper way. You have a bunch of so-called user stories. Well, what are user stories? User stories are nothing but very short descriptions of what your users do in the real world to get their own work done because they need to accomplish something. So you grab one of these user stories and you implement it. Well, how do you organize that? You organize it around the product. You look at the product as a whole and you say, what do we need to do? Or more, put it in a better way, what can the users not do now that they need to do in order to make the product a better product? And the focus is entirely on the product as a whole, not on projects, right? Individual projects are just a little corner of the product where You can't see the big picture. So there aren't any projects in an Agile system. There's just the product, and every story, I suppose you could look at as a miniature project, but every story is its own thing. So if there are no products, or if there are no projects rather, then what exactly is a project manager going to manage? And the answer is, well, there's nothing for them to manage. So, but as I said, you go into these companies that think that they're Agile, and there's project managers all over the place. They're like cockroaches. It's just when you think you've got them all stamped out, another 1,000 of them come out from under the sink. So we really don't want to have that kind of situation. So that brings me to the next of Orwell's points, also written on the Ministry of Information, which is ignorance is strength. So ignorance is strength. What does that mean? Oh, I'm sorry about the reflection here. Well, you can read it, so we'll just leave it where it is. Ignorance is strength is another important aspect of the way Agile has gone wrong. The idea here is that the Agile industrial complex people want people to be ignorant. They want people to believe their party line because they can't sell certificates if people don't believe their party line. So this notion of you are strong by not knowing too much about what's going on, is that something that the certificate people are actually pushing pretty hard. The people who are pushing Scrum don't want you to know that there's more to Agile than Scrum, because what are they going to sell if Agile is a big thing and they're a very small piece of it in the corner? So they're trying to convince people that the non-Agile thing is actually the Agile thing. The entire Agile industrial complex, to use Fowler's term, is focused on doing exactly that. And again, you see a lot of examples of that. Scrum Inc. comes to mind immediately, right? What they're peddling is not Agile. Just take Jeff Sutherland's latest book, Twice the Work in Half the Time. That's an appallingly bad title for something that's supposed to be Agile. Agile is not about work. It's not about how much output you have. It's not about producing twice as much stuff. Producing twice the garbage in half the time buys nobody anything. So the idea that Agile should somehow be doing twice as much work in less time is just craziness. It's not about output. What Agile is about is value. What Agile is about is writing software and getting it into our users' hands. And the thing that we're getting into our users' hands is something that they find valuable. It's something that lets them get something done that they couldn't get done before. So that's got nothing to do with really how fast we do it, that we want it quickly. We want to do it fast. It has to do with how valuable it is to the people who are ultimately buying our software. Now, let me say as an aside here, stand aside, give it as an aside. The speed is a factor. Is the way that all Agile systems work, and I'll talk more about this in a second, is by getting feedback. Feedback is an essential part of working in an Agile way. So we build small things, and we deploy them. We get them to our users' hands, and then we get feedback from them. And then we use that feedback to make what we just built better. Everything is done incrementally in small increments. That feedback loop has to be very tight. And in fact, in a fully Agile shop, you will be measuring the feedback loop in minutes or hours, not even in days. Is that you'll be working on something at your keyboard, and you will walk up to, or not walk up, but you'll be peering at the keyboard going, oh gosh, is this right or not? And you'll say, hey Fred, come over here, take a look at this. And somebody who actually understands the domain, ideally a customer, will literally come over and take a look at it and tell you whether you're on the right track or not. That's fast feedback. Feedback to a larger user community, well, maybe once or twice a day, you'll push something into production. In other words, you'll just check it in. You check the code in. As a side effect of that, a CI/CD pipeline will wake up and execute a whole bunch of tests, and if the automated tests pass, we'll literally push it to the user. So once or twice a day, there's a new version in the user's hands. Everybody's heard that statistic about Amazon pushing stuff out to the users once every 11 seconds. That's not that the teams are pushing out every 11 seconds. Right? The team is pushing things out maybe once a day, but there's a lot of teams in Amazon, so you put them all together and there's stuff being pushed out very quickly. But the point here is that feedback loop is really, really, really fast, or it has to be. So you need to be working in such a way that you can get feedback in a timely fashion, and that the speed is a factor there. But the speed at which we generate output is not particularly important from the normal management sense, right? Our idea is not to push more junk out to the users. The idea is to get value to the users in small increments. So the next issue then, though, is that people come in and they try and push this ignorance of strength thing by kind of deliberately teaching people the wrong things. Now, I have to say as an aside that this isn't strictly speaking true, is that I know of several extremely good Scrum coaches, for example, is that they don't follow the party line. Is they come in and they talk to people about Agile, and then they talk about how Scrum can help them do things in an Agile way. And that's a perfectly reasonable way to approach Scrum. So I don't much like Scrum, but if you're working in the right kind of corporation, the people who run the corporation will like it. Is that it provides a familiar layer around agility that makes the people that are running things happy. So if they're happy, then I'm happy. That's okay. But if you don't treat Scrum as being just a small piece of Agile, you haven't done anybody a favor. Unfortunately, all too many of the people in the Scrum industrial complex are teaching these classes as if Scrum is Agile, as if they're the same thing. And they're not. And that's actually deliberately preaching a kind of ignorance. Is that ignorance is not strength. Is you need to know a lot about a lot of things other than Scrum in order to be effective at Scrum. Because Scrum is a lightweight wrapper around Agile. And if you don't know Agile, you can't do Scrum. It's that simple. So we have a problem. The other thing that you see when the ignorance is strength problem is you go into a company and everybody's doing Scrum. Every team in the company is doing exactly the same thing. In the worst possible situation, every team in the company starts their sprint on Wednesday. And the sprints last exactly 2 weeks. And the sprints are all over on a Wednesday. And the teams are just marching in lockstep, doing exactly the same thing. And there's some company level office making sure that everybody is doing Scrum by the book. And that's the opposite of being Agile. When everybody's marching in lockstep like that. You cannot be rigid and Agile at the same time. It's just not possible. So if I go into a company and I see that everybody is doing the same thing, if everybody in the company is doing Scrum, that tells me right off the bat that it's not an Agile company, because your teams are self-organizing. I mentioned self-organizing a moment ago. Well, one of the things that goes with self-organization is the notion that the teams get to decide how they do the work. And if you look at a fully Agile company, the individual teams will all be working in slightly different ways. You look at Spotify, for example, there's several Agile processes scattered across the whole organization. And there's some Scrum teams, that's fine. But there are a lot of teams that aren't doing Scrum. There are a lot of teams that are doing variations on Scrum. There are one-day sprints, there are 1 week sprints, there are 2 week sprints. There are no sprints at all on the teams that are using different kinds of processes, something that's more linear like Kanban. And the point here is that if you're self-organizing, that's what you expect to see. So if Agile teams are self-organizing teams, the fact that we're all doing the same thing, well, that's telling me that we don't actually have an Agile organization. So marching in lockstep is kind of really a bad thing. As I said, you cannot be rigid about process and Agile, flexible at the same time. It's just not really, it just really doesn't work that way. So the third thing that Orwell had was the notion that freedom is slavery. And freedom is slavery it's another interesting term. It's the basic idea that Orwell was trying to push, was that if you were truly free to do things, that was working against you. That you could not live a fulfilled life if you actually had freedom. In order to have freedom, in order to have something that's fulfilling, there has to be structure, and that structure has to be imposed by the state. Well, of course, the situation I was just describing inside an Agile shop is exactly that. It's the state is the company, and the company is imposing process on you. You don't have any real freedom, right? In an organization like that, you can't say, I don't like Scrum, I'm not going to do it. Is that they'll just fire you. And so what they're saying is that true freedom is a kind of slavery because it's chaos. If we had true freedom, we'd have chaos, is the way that's presented. And that's, of course, not the way it works, is that when you have truly autonomous teams, that doesn't mean that they are working alone in a locked room and not talking to anybody. We're all adults, and we're all adults who want to do the best job we possibly can. So if you have independent teams, they understand that the work they're doing depends on what the other teams are doing, so the teams talk to each other. And by the same token, the people on the teams talk to each other. There's a lot of conversations going on here. So the point is that you don't need to have a process forcing everybody to march in lockstep in order to coordinate and have a coherent system in the larger sense of the word system for getting work done. The company full of adults will do that just fine without having to be forced, if you will. So the problem then is this attitude of, my God, we cannot let the teams manage themselves. How is that going to work? We have to keep control. And if you're doing that, again, you're not doing things in an agile way because the teams are self-organizing, but that gets us into the freedom of slavery. We can't give the teams freedom, not real freedom. Right? Now, again, if you look at a real agile organization, the teams have huge amounts of autonomy. The teams are in charge of their own composition. They get to decide who's on the team and who's not on the team. Teams will do their own hiring. Teams won't do firing usually because there are legal issues associated with firing, but a team can certainly decide that they don't want to work with somebody anymore and say to the so-called human resources department, don't get me started on the word resources used to mean human being, but they'll say to the human resources department, we can't work with this guy, so find some team that can work with him better. That's different than firing. That's just saying we, the team, can't work with him, but that doesn't mean that he's not competent. Doesn't mean that he can't work with anybody. It just means that there's a personality conflict or something that's preventing it from happening with us. But the point is the teams are in charge of that. The teams have the freedom to decide how they're going to work. The teams have the freedom to decide what they're going to work on. So you have a big product backlog that has a list of all of the things that need to get done. It's sorted in order of value to the customer. Now, ideally, you're pulling things off of that backlog in value order, but there are perfectly good technical reasons to not do that sometime. Is that teams will look at that backlog and they'll say, the third thing on the list, if we do that first, we'll be able to do the first and second things much more quickly. So if that's the case, of course, that's the way you want to do the work. So the teams make that decision as they look at the backlog and they say, I want to work on that one, even if it isn't the one on the top. Is that one of the huge dysfunctions I see in a lot of fake agile pseudo-scrum shops is the PO, the product owner, has turned into some kind of manager who's assigning work to the teams. You must do this. And that's not the way it works, is that when you have freedom, when you have a fully self-organizing situation, the teams get to decide what they're going to work on, but we're all grown-ups, we're all adults. Is that nobody is going to work on something that's going to damage the company. We're going to work on the things that are most valuable to the customer. So there are always constraints, let's put it that way. And as adults, we understand that those constraints are there and we work around them, and that's fine. So the issue then is that we don't have the freedom we need. We need the freedom to invent processes. We need the freedom to be agile. We need the freedom to look at what we're doing and improve it. We need the freedom to make product decisions, right? And to talk about agile and speed, we need that fast feedback loop. Well, how does that work? Well, the way that works is that you give something, you put it into your users' hands, and then you talk to them. And then they come back and say, well, this is okay, but we really need this change. And then you make the change right then. If you have to get permission from somebody to make a product level change, then you're not being agile anymore. So the teams have to be able to make lots of decisions, which are often made in centralized ways in these companies that are not working in actual agile ways. And that's a big problem, right? Is that the team is empowered to do its own work. It's trusted to do its own work. Of course, there's also a level of fear there, right? Is that if you have a control-focused management hierarchy, the people in management kind of understand that they're not actually doing anything useful. So when they start hearing the teams managing their own work, they start thinking, so what about me? I'm a manager. If the teams are managing their own work, what am I going to do? And that's a perfectly legitimate fear, is that if you look at fully agile organizations, there isn't much in the way of middle management. So one has to think of something else to do in that kind of situation. And clearly they worry about that. When I work as an agile coach, what I typically do when I do agile work is I often work at the team level, where I'll sit down with the teams and literally pair with people and program, right, do stuff hands-on. But more often than not, I'm working up at the executive level, where I'm coming in and I'm looking at an organization and I'm saying, well, what's wrong here? Where are you agile? Where are you not agile? And how can we fix that? One of the first things you have to do in order to successfully transition to Agile is take care of the people who don't have anything to do in an Agile world. All those middle managers who are afraid of their jobs, quite justifiably, if you don't help them, they're going to be fighting tooth and nail to prevent Agile from happening. And if half the company is working hard to prevent Agile from happening, it's never going to happen, believe me. So the companies that transition successfully, they talk to people, they say, this job is not going to be here anymore, the job that you have. That doesn't mean that you're not going to be here anymore, but it means that the job you're doing is going to change. So we have some choices here. You can learn how to do the new job. That's fine. You can decide you don't want to have anything to do with it, which is fine too, in which case we will actively help you find another job, right? Not kick you out on the street and you're on your own, but we'll keep paying you until you find another job somewhere that will be satisfying, will be gratifying to you. So you need to help the people in the middle in order to be able to move forward. You can't just ignore people, right? So another central aspect of agility is that Agile is a very people-focused thing. The other thing that I see a lot in terms of the freedom of slavery is this in the real world argument. This statement that, well, that's all well and good, but that's kind of ivory tower thinking. And in the real world, we can't do that. And that's sort of a nonsensical argument. What do they mean by real world? In my real world, you can do it because I see people do it. It works. In their real world, you can't do it because they've never experienced anything other than what they've experienced, which is usually a tightly controlled, focused organization that's not working in any kind of agile way and has no hope of ever being able to work in any kind of agile way. So the issue here then is that the actual real world, Agile works just fine, right? There are a lot of big companies that do things in Agile ways. Spotify, of course, is the poster child of agility, but you have banks, ANC Bank in Australia and New Zealand. There are medical companies, Medtronics, Viva, NASA does things in an Agile way. There's plenty of retail organizations that are doing things in an Agile way. It's Home Depot, for example. I know the CTO at Kohl's, who's moving them very much into a true Agile way of doing things. And so agility actually works in the real world. It just doesn't work in the real world of the people who are objecting to it. So the company that one works for is not the real world. So that finally gets us to the Scrum is Agile part, which I've really been talking about all along, so I don't need that I know that I even have to write it down. Because Scrum is not Agile. They're not the same thing. Scrum is from my point of view, what Scrum is it's a wrapper around Agile that makes it more palatable to people that don't actually want to be Agile. Is that it provides a structured, controlled environment that appeals to companies that are used to structured, controlled environments, but it has nothing to do with agility. Or to put it another way, going back to that original book on Agile, so Ken Schwaber and Mike Beadle's original book, not on Agile, but on Scrum, where their notion was that Scrum is something that you can do alongside XP in order to make XP more business-like, right? That was the way they were pushing Scrum. That can work, but the problem is that Agile works, right? XP, extreme programming, works fine. And Scrum plus XP works fine. And in fact, Scrum without XP doesn't work at all. But more importantly, XP without Scrum works just fine. So if that's the case, I ask myself, what value is Scrum adding to the picture? And I can't find any, really. So it's a technique it's a bunch of management things that make sense to some managers, but it's certainly not necessary if you're going to do things in an agile way. And when these bad trainers come along and they say, well, Scrum is agile, or even worse, SAFe is agile, right? The scaled agile, so-called scaled agile framework is agile. They're lying to you. It's not true, because these are all kind of wrappers around agility. SAFe is a replacement for agility. SAFe is not an agile process at all. It's a big, complicated bunch of rules that you have to follow to the letter. Mandates what all the meetings look like, and all these. Don't get me started. I could do an hour on what's wrong with SAFe. SAFe might be a perfectly good process, but it's not an agile process, because agile has to be agile. It has to be flexible. It has to. The people who are doing it have to have the flexibility to work in ways that they think are effective. And if you start making changes to the way you're working, you're not doing SAFe or Scrum anymore. So no technique that mandates the way that you work is an agile technique. It just doesn't work that way. So agile is all about flexibility. Is that if you look at SAFe, if you look at Scrum, there is no flexibility there. In the Scrum Guide, it says specifically that Scrum is defined by the Scrum Guide in its entirety, and that if you are not doing Scrum as defined by the Scrum Guide, well, then you're just not doing Scrum. So it's a very rigid framework. It says exactly what you have to do, and if you don't do exactly what it says, then you're not doing Scrum. Well, as I said earlier, you cannot be rigid and agile at the same time. It's just not possible. So the other issue, which I think is an important one, is a lesson that comes out of the lean manufacturing world. Now, I'll bring up lean with a little bit of trepidation, is that we are not working in factories. And there's a tendency sometimes to have people talk about things that do work in factories as if we can apply those concepts directly to software development and have it work. But the fact is that software development is a very different thing than building a car. And simply because something does work in a factory does not mean that it's going to work for us doing software. On the other hand, there are a lot of things in lean that are really, really valuable in the software world. One of the key things is the notion of the team being in charge of the work. That's something that came out of lean thinking, is that if you look at a Toyota factory, for example, every team gets to decide how it's going to do whatever it does at its workstation. And that sort of control is built into the culture of the way things work. Now, what I want to bring up here is the NUMMI plant used to be in Fremont, California, down where the Tesla plant is now. New United Motors was a joint effort between Toyota and General Motors, and they were building cars, and they were doing that using very, very lean, if you will, agile techniques. The plant started out as one of the least effective car factories on the planet. It was huge absentee rates. They were not productive at all. There were huge numbers of defects coming out of the cars that were being produced there. And Toyota moved in, and within a couple of years, it had become one of the best manufacturing plants in the. You can't see it, but I have a dog down here who's bugging me, so I will reach down and pet him occasionally. But the issue here is that transition happened because they were applying lean principles. Now, one of those lean principles, again, key one, is that the people working on the teams get to decide how they are going to do their own work. And there are some things that happen in lean that don't happen in agile typically. For example, there's a lot of documentation, a lot of process documentation that happens as part of Toyota's process that you tend to not see in the agile world. That's fine. It's just a natural difference between the two approaches. But the important thing is that teams decide how they do their own work. So what happened, right? The point of this story is rambling on here, but the point of the story is that GM didn't understand that at all. Is that what GM did is they said, oh, the teams are working in a way that's very, very effective, and they've documented it. They've written everything down. There's all these details about exactly what they do. So they took that documentation and they put it in a box, and they flew back to Detroit, and they said to the factories in Detroit, you will now work exactly the way we're working in Fremont. You will do what this documentation said. And it was a complete, utter disaster. It was a failure.
I can tell. That's not true. Your hair is clean.
I'm hearing you guys talk. Should I be? Well, anyway, it was a complete disaster. So the point here is that the processes don't transfer. Is you can't take a process that was developed in one place and use it in another. Now, Scrum, let's look at Scrum. Ken Schwaber had a team back around 2000 that was a very effective team. And that team was doing something which came to be called Scrum. They developed their own practice. They developed their own process. And it worked great for them. But you cannot transfer that process out of Ken's team any more than you can take a process on a workstation and an assembly line and transfer it to another assembly line. Practices do not transfer. What does transfer are values. And that's the key issue here, is that Agile is defined by a set of values. And teams, to be effective in an Agile way, have to develop their own processes in such a way that they, I hate to use the word conform, but they align with the common values that you see across all Agile organizations. So the values are what's important. It's the values that can transfer. It's the principles that transfer. The actual way in which you do the work, that does not transfer at all. That's something that has to be developed by the teams that are doing the work. So you look at the Agile Manifesto. The Agile Manifesto really defines what is Agile and what is not. And you look at the Agile Manifesto, and the fact is that it's entirely values and principles. 12 principles, 4 values, nothing else. Actually, one of the principles is also a practice. Only one, though, right? The one principle that is actually a practice is retrospectives, right? Is that the Agile Manifesto says that periodically you need to stop what you're doing and look around and assess the way that you do things and change the way that you do things in order to make them better. The only change I would make to that is that I believe in the lean notion of continuous improvement. I don't think you should stop every 2 weeks and do a retrospective. I think you should be constantly looking at the way you're doing things and fixing them. Is that it's a continuous process from my point of view. It's not something that happens periodically on some schedule. So the only practice, in other words, that's in there is continuous improvement, but continuous improvement is also a cultural value. You can't do continuous improvement if you're not working in a culture that sets things up so that it values that improvement work. If, again, you have one of these organizations that's making everybody march in lockstep, there is no culture of continuous improvement in that kind of organization at all. So, or there's no way to have a common culture in that kind of organization at all. So the basic idea here then is that things are not going to transfer, and the Scrum is Agile is just nonsense, right? Because it's saying we have a solution, right? One of the good indicator of this that I really found kind of repulsive, to be honest, is that back when the COVID-19 was at its worst, where the hospitals were overflowing and people were dying and people were having to be triaged into getting healthcare or not, Jeff Sutherland got onto Twitter and he said, the hospitals that are helping people are doing Scrum. And if the hospitals where people are dying would do Scrum, people wouldn't die. And that's just repulsive to me. It's just not true. Is that he took that quote, that tweet down within about 20 minutes of putting it up. But I think he actually believed that. So the point here is that this notion that that the framework rules, right? That Scrum is what's important, and if we all do Scrum, all our problems will be solved. That's just a nonsensical notion. That has to do with selling Scrum certificates. That has nothing at all to do with actual agility. So let's talk for a moment then about what Agile actually is. How are we doing for time here? Let's talk for a moment about what Agile actually is. First of all, if you're going to be Agile, people have to be first. So that's the first order of business. People have to be first. So self-organization is an indication of that. People get to decide how they work. At the center of the notions of agility is the notion of trust, right? Is that you have to be able to trust people to get the job done. You trust people to work in the way that they need to work. You trust people to spend money in ways that make sense. There's a story around Spotify about how an entire team was working with another team in New York. A team in Sweden was working with a team in New York. And the team in Europe decided that they needed to actually get together and have some face-to-face time with the people in New York. And they just all bought plane tickets and went to New York. They didn't ask anybody. There was no permission. There was no hierarchy that you had to go up and down in order to get approval. They just did it. They all had company credit cards. They bought plane tickets. They organized for hotels, and they just went. So that's what trust is. That's what putting people first is. If you don't trust the teams to do the work, you can't move fast enough. If you have to ask permission, it slows you down. And our goal here then is to produce software as quickly as possible, but we want the software to be right. We want it to be valuable. So that's the next important value, right? That working software is all that matters. What we're trying to do, and by working, I don't mean it just barely works. I mean it does something valuable and it works well. High quality, well-written, well-engineered software with a good architecture in it. That's what working means to me. And the rate at which you can produce working software is really the only metric that matters, right? Are we getting working software into our users' hands? If you are not delivering, you are not agile. So if you're doing Scrum and you're only delivering once every 2 weeks, that's too long, I think. You need to be pushing stuff out to your users faster. The next value, we work collaboratively. Agile organizations cannot work if people are isolated into little silos working alone. This is a big deal nowadays in the COVID world. Is the all too often working from home has come to mean I'm going to work in my own personal silo. I won't talk to anybody else all day, or maybe once or twice a day I'll communicate with other people, but otherwise I'm working alone. That's not a team. Right? That's a bunch of individuals working separately, talking occasionally. Agile work is truly collaborative. Now you can collaborate on Zoom. Is that I do mob programming workshops with people on Zoom all the time, and it works great. So this is not COVID forcing us to do it. This is just not thinking in an agile way. We need to work collaboratively. Communication is an essential part of this. Is that if you are not communicating with each other, you cannot be flexible enough. So communication also means you have to communicate with your customers. Communication is a constant process. You are constantly talking to the people that you're working with. You are constantly talking to your customers. You are constantly getting feedback. All of this has to do with conversation. So there is an underlying conversation through the whole system that is essential to being agile. Welcoming change. Of course, you have to welcome change in order to be agile because that's what agility is about. But what that really means is that we learn as we work. The key concept here is we learn as we work. So as we're working, we're learning things, and we want to incorporate that learning into the way we work and into the things we build as soon as we learn it. Not months from now, but right now. So, or to put it another way, all plans fail. And the reason plans fail is because we are learning. If you're not learning, or rather it's the learning that changes the plan. Technical excellence, another characteristic of all agile organizations, is that if you don't have a good architecture, if your code is not high quality, you simply can't be agile because it slows you down too much. If you need to make a small change, if you can't make that small change very, very quickly, then you just simply can't work in an agile way. Assessment, right? I was talking about the only thing that they have in the Agile Manifesto that really matters is the notion of regular assessment. And regular assessment is an essential part of, again, being agile, right? Is that you have to be able to be flexible about the way you work. You have to be looking at what is working and what's not working, and you always need to be amplifying the good and phasing out the bad. You always need to be moving things in the direction of being more effective. So I don't know if anybody noticed, but what I just went through is basically the Agile Manifesto. So the real issue about whether you want to be agile or not is you are aligning with the values in the Agile Manifesto. And, sometimes you see that incorporated into something that's a little bit easier to remember, right? The XP, for example, as the XP values are what? Communication, simplicity, feedback, courage. That's a big one. Courage, right? Is that Agile is a radical departure from what we're doing. It's really revolutionary. And if you don't have a certain amount of courage, you're never going to make that work. And then finally, respect for the people that are doing the work, trust for people that are doing the work. So you can take all of the things I was just discussing and kind of concentrate it down into a set of five keywords, if you will. But the point here is that all of the things I were just talking about, that's what makes a company agile. And all of the other junk, all of the processes, all the garbage that's in Scrum, right? All the product owners and Scrum masters and sprints and all that junk. None of that is part of being agile. None of it. Because those are things that you might come up with in order to implement some of the things I was just talking about, but those are secondary and they will change. Because if you're being agile, you're flexible about the way that you do the work and you're constantly improving it. So those ways of doing things are going to change. So, of course, there's a lot more to agility than what I can talk about in 45 minutes or so, or 50 minutes or so. And I obviously can't talk about that now. There's a lot to learn. I have a reading list on my website. I'll put the URL up here. Holub.com/reading, surprisingly. A long reading list, a whole bunch of books that you can read in order to get better at this. But the point is that if you have the values and if you follow the principles, what you're going to end up with is something that works in a very agile way.